This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Joining me from London is Dr. Prakash Shah. Dr. Prakash Shah, renowned academic and, of course, commentator on India-UK matters. Prakash Shah, welcome.
Namaste.
I want to begin by talking about the riots that's happening in England over the last several weeks. That's going to be the theme of our conversation today. The riots began several weeks ago and they don't seem to be stopping. To begin with, there were talk about the far right, creating ruckus in certain places. But then that was only one point of view. Then there were all these Asian gangs, so to speak, as the journalists in the UK insist on calling them, Muslim gangs, as some newspapers have noted. All of this got triggered by one deadly incident in Southport where three young girls, very young girls, under the age of 10, were really stabbed and killed by, we don't know the real identity of this person, but it seems like this person was born in England, but is of Rwandan origin. That's all we know about this at the moment. This, of course, has triggered what seems to be a larger societal crisis, Dr. Shah.
Yes, in a way, yes, you could say that. In terms of the trigger for the recent incidents, which have been going on since the 29th of July, since the murders that you mentioned in the town of Southport, that you might say was the most immediate cause of the trigger for the unrest. But if we were to put that horrific incident in some context, and also the ensuing, let's say, unrest, if not riots, also in context, you might have to go back some time. So a few days before the Southport incident, which was on 29 July, there was an incident in Manchester Airport where videos were released of a police officer using excessive force to subdue actually two men, and I think their mother was caught up in the ruckus as well. So clips of that incident were shared, and assumptions were made about the overuse of force by the police. In fact, you might argue that the video evidence did reveal that there was overuse of force, but subsequent releases of longer footage were made, and you could see that actually one of the men had previously beaten a female police officer to the extent of breaking her nose. Now, details of that are going to be analyzed, I think, in due course. The investigations are already going on the way. But what was very upsetting for a large group of British people was that information was only being seeped out selectively. And that means that there was a large suspicion that an accurate version of what had gone on was being suppressed, and it was being suppressed because of the ethnicity or religion of the young men involved in the ruckus. And so the temperatures were rising already at that point. Now, of course, if you go much further back, you've got a series of incidents going on. There was a
clarification for our audience. What happened at the Manchester airport, of course, were involving these young Muslim men. And when selective clips came out, some community leaders, so to speak, seem to have come out and said that there's going to be widespread protest, unprecedented in a sense protest. But in response to that, when longer clips came out, the situation seemed to be far more complicated than initially assumed. And this, of course, also, Dr. Shah, came only a few weeks after a lot of conversation about this group called the Muslim Vote, which you and I have also spoken about on Global Order, and its influence on the most recent British elections and the people it, in a sense, supported and were able to get into parliament. So this has been going on for a long time. In between all of this, of course, news came that a long-standing offender, Anjum Chaudhary, who used to giving extremely radical statements, had in fact finally been given a very long sentence for consistently supporting extremist activity within the UK. So a long complex history, Dr. Shah.
Very much so, and that's those Anjum Chowdhury's was not the only arrest. There was also the arrest of Majid Freeman, who was arguably one of the people who gave fuel to what happened in Leicester a couple of years ago now. So there's been a series of incidents like that, but also there's been more grievous, let's say, occurrences in terms of murders of MPs, of blowing up of concerts where children are attending, in, for example, the Manchester bombing, and so on and so forth. So we're looking at a whole series of, let's say, a kind of picture of criminality. Of course, you could add in the grooming gangs scandals, which have been, for over the last 10 or 20 years, they've been unfolding, and horrific crimes have been uncovered. So there's a massive, if you like, churn within the society where there's so much upset, particularly about people of migrant origin, and particularly of Muslim origin, who are involved in all kinds of different criminality, criminal behaviors. But what is more important to note in this context is what's been labeled now as a kind of two-tier system. So when people of immigrant origin or Muslim origin are involved in some kind of suspected criminality or actual criminality, there's a tendency to suppress information about the who is involved, exactly the identity of those who are involved. Now that may or may not be in conformity with applicable legal procedures, but the fact is that the suspicions are raised because of the behavior of the media, police, and so on and so forth. And what one can also detect some kind of two-tier implementation of the law when it comes to prosecution or even arrest of suspected offenders. So, for example, the perpetrators of the Manchester incidents, the attack on the police officers, the police officers were suspended. Investigations going on about their role, but the Pakistani Muslim, let's say those who were involved in the incident, no charges have been brought against them. Although there's very clear video footage of the fact that at least one of them was involved in the beating up of this female police officer. So you've got the accumulation of those kinds of incidents, which really raises the suspicion that there's a kind of two-tier system of justice, and particularly white people or white British people feel a sense of deep grievance. So when the Southport events happened, all this has already happened in the background, and you can really feel that there was some sort of accumulation of grievances about inadequate policing and two-tier justice dispensation. Now, of course, in the immediate aftermath of the Southport incidents, you also got the circulation of information, which happened to be false, that the perpetrator was Muslim. Right, and that happened on an underground basis because the mainstream media was not involved in that. So somehow some suspicion was raised within maybe social media and so on. And in fact, it turns out that in the last couple of days, a woman has been arrested for circulating false information about the involvement, the alleged involvement of a Muslim person in the Southport incidents. So that acted as a trigger, a very important trigger for the immediate aftermath and led to unrest, you might say even riots in some places. That we have to balance with some information which has been coming through that most of the protests post the Southport incidents have actually been peaceful, right? So it's been a select group of perhaps instigators, and we don't know who they're being instigated by necessarily. There's a lot of suspicion about who is involved and so on, whether it's politicians, whether it's other agitators and so on. But it's not really clear how much of the protesting has actually been violent or of a criminal nature. But certainly, criminal charges have been brought against some of the more violent, let's say, participants. Now, you started off your introduction saying that there's been, I can't remember exactly the words used, but very large scale protests and, let's say, riots and so on. I have my doubts about that. And in fact, I think if we were going to analyze the situation today, we'd probably find that there's hardly any unrest up and down the country. In fact, I've not seen any reports so far. And that we have to also consider by adding in the factor of false rumors. So, for example, a few days ago, I think maybe on Tuesday earlier this week, information was being circulated, including in email groups that I'm a member of, that a list of those legal advice centers or solicitors who specialize in immigration advice was going to be attacked. And so the list was actually given, right? Which towns they're located in, the exact name of the office or service, and the exact address. So it very much looked like there were going to be a concerted series of attacks on, let's say, those who are perceived to be assisting the continuation of illegal migration into Britain, which is, of course, a big background factor, which we haven't discussed enough already. And the attacks were meant to happen on Wednesday, so a couple of days ago. It turned out that nothing happened, right? And in fact, one of the people who seems to be the spokesperson for an anti-racism charity seemed to have admitted already by Thursday that the list was a hoax. Now, it'd been very interesting to understand what the origin of that list was, right? But it so happened that by Wednesday, when the attacks were supposed to happen, a mass series of demonstration up and down the country happened, right? By so-called anti-racist, leftist, pro-Palestinians, a motley group of people on the left, primarily, which is pretty surprising if you consider how spontaneous it could have been. Like, it wouldn't have taken, it would have demanded a lot of organization. But if you looked at the very well prepared placards and so on, you'd have thought actually it was a very well organized demonstration and would have taken days, if not weeks to plan. So this raises suspicions about what's actually going on. There's an undercurrent of something else, or suspicion that something else is at play here, right? Where perhaps rumors, misinformation, and so on are being manipulated to provoke certain types of responses in the larger population. So I'm very suspicious about what's actually happening in the background. And I'm probably not the only one. There are many other commentators who also suspect that some sort of larger play might be happening. But of course, one doesn't want to be labeled a conspiracy theorist, right? So one can only infer from the evidence that's available and try to put two and two together and figure out what's happening. And actually, it's not easy to explain what's been happening and the way in which the series of events has unfolded.
Let me take one example and ask you, because you're talking about this, Dr. Shah. In Birmingham, 3 days ago, there seems to be an incident where, quote unquote, counter protesters had gathered waiting for protesters and who never turned up, and then the counter protesters went on rampage. And the thing that you mentioned about two tiers of society, which is the common complaint. And Twitter has been full about this hashtag called two-tier care, basically a sort of allegation that the incumbent prime minister is not doing enough to break this assessment that has been created in many minds that the British legal system and the media system has in fact become in some ways a two-tier system, which you also mentioned. There has also been an advisory from many countries, including India, suggesting that their citizens be careful about visiting certain parts of the UK. All of this, of course, we mentioned a bunch of things, but I think we missed out on one thing. Shamima Begum, the ISIS bride, lost her final appeal. And I was reading a BBC piece on this. And in fact, the British journalist Naomi Canton pointed this out on Twitter, that the BBC story was almost written as if consistently trying to say that in fact she should have been allowed to return to the UK, and in a sense almost sort of pushing the her crimes, her very violent crimes of joining the ISIS and plotting attacks, to the side. All of this is a volatile mix, Dr. Shah, and all the things that you're explaining, rumors, counter rumors, some things happening, some things not happening. Even when they're not happening, other groups are exploding. All of this happens in a society where a lot of rumors are going on and a lot of anxiety has been created essentially in many minds.
So one of the things that I'm inferring from the long and complicated series of events that we've started to discuss is that there's some kind of attempt to placate, particularly the Muslim population, that look, the state is looking after your interests. Please don't engage in counter-violence. And of course, there are good grounds to think that counter-violence is either happening or would have happened on a much larger scale than it has already happened in response to the Southport incidents, because a mosque has been attacked and so on. So there are particular signs that let's say Muslim interests or Muslims themselves have been either threatened or made to feel insecure, and as a result, there's been demonstrations of Muslim men primarily, and there's been accompanied by chants of Allahu Akbar, and those kinds of incidents have they haven't been just isolated ones, but fairly widespread, might say, from the available footage that you see on social media. And one of the former conservative ministers has mentioned that perhaps one ought to make unlawful the chanting of Allahu Akbar in public in this particular way, which has also then resulted in its own kind of counter reaction from Muslim spokespersons and so on. But the larger picture here, as I'm trying to relate, is that there is a kind of overall sense that a placation is in play. Now you can judge that by the number of people who came out on the streets in the form of anti-racism marches and so on. Many of them also waving Palestinian flags, by the way. The reaction of the police authorities, who've tended to be very conciliatory towards the so-called community leaders within the Muslim community. They've even begun their meetings with the opening phrase "Salamu alaikum," and that kind of very placating behavior. There is also a sense that some further official recognition of norms against Islamophobia will happen. That's already there's been a report in the Telegraph newspaper today that the Labour government is considering how to make a definition of Islamophobia stick more legally. And that already comes in the background of, since we last spoke, actually, what I've discovered is that there is an equal treatment bench book, which is issued by the Judicial Studies Board in England and Wales. And that already has mention of Islamophobia, right? In order to explain to judges, so judges can freely refer to this kind of document when making their decisions and acquire some sort of understanding of a whole array of diversity issues at play. But Islamophobia is given its own section. And what's very interesting here is that the all-party parliamentary group on Muslims, which issued a report in 2018, setting out a kind of definition of Islamophobia, that's mentioned in the Equal Treatment Bench Book. What's also mentioned is the Muslim Council of Britain within the same Equal Treatment Bench Book. Now, what's remarkable about that is that the Muslim Council of Britain is a body with which successive governments since the late period of the Tony Blair government have refused to interact with because of their Islamist credentials, right, or their close association with known Islamists. So it's very remarkable that a manual which is supposed to assist the British judiciary in making its decisions and to be informed about ethnic religious diversity in Britain has specific mention of an uncritical mention of the Muslim Council of Britain in this particular way. Not only that, the definition of the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, which I mentioned earlier, the definition of Islamophobia, is itself extremely problematic because one of the things it does is to suggest, by cross-reference to academic authorities, and without criticizing such academic authorities, what it does is to essentially endorse a conception of Islamophobia such that mention of Muslim involvement in grooming gangs or female genital mutilation, such acts which you might think are, ordinarily criminal acts, which they are under British law, it makes it illegitimate and Islamophobic to mention or to associate Muslims with such patterns of behavior. So you can see the extent to which this kind of report goes, right? So it's not benign, right? It's actually going to have widespread suppressive effects in the society, right? And erode freedoms which are very closely tied to English conceptions of liberty. So that's very problematic. And to have that appear in the Equal Treatment Bench Book for the judiciary, in my view, is remarkable. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the legal recognition of Islamophobia is already happening, right? I think in our last discussion, I also mentioned that something like 50 plus British local authorities have already adopted the same all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims definition of Islamophobia, as they can pass resolutions in council meetings and so on. And so they've done that. Right. So again, you can say that has a quasi-legal effect because it will have implications for people who work within the local authorities, the employees, and so on. So in all kinds of ways, Islamophobia has already become a kind of current normative, let's say, no, right? You cannot be Islamophobic. Now, what's also extremely worrying, the other day, I came across a message on
So
Twitter
people
X.
worry, Dr. Shah, that when this kind of stuff becomes normative, and nobody obviously will support purposeful targeting or maligning of any religion, but when this kind of stuff becomes normative, it's a slippery slope. It basically then prohibits and prevents any criticism of organized religion.
Yes, correct. Yes, and is religious doctrines, which one might say that in a liberal society are actually they're open for criticism and discussion, right? But here, one is actually discouraged, perhaps even penalized from doing that. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is that you must be aware of Amnesty, the large so-called human rights organization. Now, of course, they've had suspicions of being, very fairly pro-Islamists for a number of years, since 9/11 particularly. And they've tended to work quite closely with people in the Cage organization, which is also a kind of Islamist organization with terror links, actually. Now, I saw a message sent on behalf of Amnesty UK a couple of days ago, where they have a propaganda video criticizing and wanting the withdrawal of the anti-radicalization program run by the British government called Prevent. And what they do is repeat a series of talking points which Islamist organizations have been using against the Prevent program, right? And basically, they're based on suspicions and false information and so on. And much of this is actually detailed in a book by a advisor of the former government, Sarah Khan, who wrote a book called The Battle for British Islam, in which she she provides a lot of detail of the way in which the Prevent program has there have been attempts to discredit the Prevent program by spreading misinformation, and much of this is actually being done by Islamist organization, but a lot of other people tend to participate in this kind of misinformation as well, perhaps out of being extremely credulous, or some people might use the phrase useful idiocy, that kind of stuff. So there's a broad spectrum of society who would actually buy into this, particularly among the elites. And I don't think you can describe an organization like Amnesty UK other than being an elite organization within British society, right? And a lot of people tend to buy into that because of its supposed credibility in human rights circles. So those kinds of things have been happening. So if you want to draw a picture of placation, now the question is,
And I want to add one thing before you go on to your next part, Dr. Shah, if I may. One of the problems is that, even vocalization of these things seems to be a problem. Even in 2024, and this was true even 5, 10 years ago, British journalists and newspapers cannot seem to identify and vocalize who the perpetrators of violence are. They are very happy to say far right, which is absolutely fine as far as I'm concerned, no problem there. But when it comes to the other perpetrators, they keep on saying Asian men. Now, I first noticed this Asian men business about nearly 10 years ago, where on reporting about that horrific, grooming gangs incident. Now, all those men in that incident, the infamous incident, all those men were basically Pakistani Muslims. And yet the British press could not get itself to say Pakistani Muslim. They had to keep saying Asian men. In 2024, I saw on Twitter an LBC, I think it's a radio network journalist, who was saying that he had to run away from one part of, a town that he was in because he was threatened by quote unquote Asian men. Now, for us in other parts of the world, we listen to this and look at this and think, what do you mean by Asian men? Were they Singaporean? Were they Thai? Were they Malaysian, Indonesian? Maybe they were even Chinese, but we all know that's not true. They were not any of these. They were essentially mostly either Pakistani men or Middle Eastern men, of a particular sort of, or North African men, so to speak. Now, and yet, the press can't seem to even vocalize that. They keep saying Asian men. Now, I have no problems in being protective about people's identity and background so that they don't feel ostracized. I think that's a very humane thing to do. But if you can't even point out for decades where the problem lies in the communities in which the problem lies, quite like you're pointing out that the problem lies in the far right among certain communities, certain people in the far right, very happy to point that out. How will this get sorted, Dr. Shah?
Correct, correct. So, it's a bit like the discussion that's happening with reference to similar labels being used in the United States. So there's on social media, there's a debate about whether one should use South Asian and why do we use South Asian when we actually mean Indian and so on. So here also there is this sort of attempt at, let's say, terminological slippage. This is part and parcel of, actually, it's a long-standing methodology of placation, right? Because let's say, the journalists, the media, the politicians, and so on know that were they to use the word Muslim, they would get outrage, right? So a barrage of, let's say, emails, representations, and so on, which would frustrate all their other work. So they would rather not deal with that and just use some kind of label, which sounds neutral. But of course, what it does is to create the impression that um, as you rightly suggest, people of Asian background in general, which in Britain doesn't mean Singaporean. It means anybody who is from the Indian subcontinent, basically, right? So it could be Indians, Bangladeshis, whatever, right? So Sri Lankans and so on. But so there is the risk that any people falling into any of those categories could be targeted by, maybe for revenge attacks and so on. But
Put
there's
one
the
more
other side.
problem to you in that, Dr. Shah. It is when you do this for years and years that people begin to suspect that something is always being hidden. So even when it's
Correct.
not true, like perhaps in the Southport case, very
Correct.
quickly a rumor goes around that, look, this sort of hiding is happening once again, and therefore people's anger rises. It is because they have seen a trend over many, many years of this kind of behavior that they easily suspect that this might be true once again.
Correct. Yes. I mean, among let's say, the Indian population, they pretty much know that this feature, if you like, of media behavior is entrenched. Many Asian people, many non-Muslim Asian people, try to challenge this on a continued basis, including journalists and other commentators. But no notice seems to be taken of it. A minority of non-Asian people, let's say, I don't know, among the majority population and so on, also try to point this out on a regular basis. But they are also disregarded. Um, on the other hand, we seem to understand, let's say, within that the public discourse is such that whenever the term Asian is being used, we actually mean Muslim. So it's almost as though people are no longer fooled, as you correctly suggest, and it is understood that when the term Asian is being used, yes, we are almost definitely speaking about a Muslim. So as a prophylactic, it doesn't really, even as you say, for years and years it's been happening. It stops doing its job, right? It becomes ineffective because in the public mind it's associated with Islam.
I have one last question for you, Dr. Shah. We have seen in this year, beginning with the, you know, pro-Palestinian protests in central London and in other parts of the UK, then going on to all the ruckus with the elections, then now, all this sort of, protests and clashes and riots. We have seen, I mean, England has seen a really tumultuous, terrible time for most of this year. I want to ask you, there seems to be something shifting in British society. Um, even the usage that we were just discussing, I noticed that perhaps in a rare instance, the Telegraph newspaper, which is a really big newspaper, actually didn't use that cover dressing at all. It sort of named whoever were the real assailants. Now something is shifting, and there seems to be social fissures that are deepening, darkening, should I say, and there's a lot of turbulence in it. What do you see happening in the days, months, and years to come?
Yeah, this is a very good question. It requires a little bit of conjecture and speculation, or if I was to be generous to myself, a kind of inference making. um, why is all this placation happening, right? On the one hand, of course, we've got a Muslim population which is very much skewed to the younger age groups. which has particularly a male population, but probably with many female supporters, which is not reluctant to use violence in order to secure its demands, were it perceived that violence is necessary. So, for example, the kind of reaction you see to the Southport protests and so on. But you also have an extremely large number of people who are being monitored under the terrorism legislation, right? Which means that this propensity of violence is actually very well acknowledged and noticed by the state authorities, which I would say increases the necessity of the state having to continuously placate this particular segment of the population. Now, add to that what could be happening in international relations in the very near future, right? Imagine that there is a war with Iran. What do you think would happen in Britain if there is a war with Iran? I mean, I asked that both as a serious question and as a rhetorical question. I mean, take it as in any way you want.
Seeing
But
answers to that on what is happening with the war in Gaza.
yes, with the war in Gaza, we haven't had, as far as I can see, although I've been anticipating it, um, terrorist attacks in Britain, because that did happen after the war in Iraq, right? So after the election in 2005, you got the London bombings of 7th July of 2005 within a space of a few weeks, right? And so you see that the return of the Tony Blair Labour government was largely blamed for the Iraq war, resulted in some kind of revenge terror attacks on British soil, right? And the most grievous ones that we saw up to that point. I suppose Britain hasn't been directly involved in the Gaza war, although there's been a lot of accusation of Britain indirectly being involved, and how British authorities should be, let's say, sued for their supplying of arms and other types of support to the Israelis. So terror attacks haven't happened in the aftermath of the, let's say, 8th October and post Gaza conflict. But should a war occur with Iran, I think it's not really beyond one's imagination to anticipate very, very serious unrest in Britain. Right now,
I want to put one last question. Sorry, go on, please go on.
I'll just round off with
yes, please.
One other point. So some people have predicted that in the not too distant future, now this is regardless of what happens with Iran and so on, we will be in a situation pretty much resembling a kind of Northern Ireland conflict throughout Britain with respect to particularly the Muslim population. Now, one can talk about the degrees to which that might be a true prediction, or when the time frame in which that would happen, but it's almost certain to happen, and I sort of agree with that kind of diagnosis. So even if something like a war with Iran doesn't happen, you've still got to take measures to deal with the Muslim population in Britain, right? And so you might say that the placation is also about a longer term strategy of friendliness and let's say deflecting chance of violent occurrences throughout British society. Sorry, you were going to say, yeah.
My last question is that this also makes it difficult for many, ordinary Muslim citizens who, your average, worker in an office, or a student, or a professor, or a, park lane surgeon, or a NHS doctor, and so on and so forth. Many ordinary, Muslim families who may be living in Britain for a long, long time, all of this also vitiates the climate for them, isn't it?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. It's by no means the case that, every Muslim has, very close kind of closely subscribes to Islamism or Salafism or something like that. That's not the case, obviously. Large segments do, however, do that, right? I mean, if you look at the levels of support for Hamas, for example, probably we're talking about something like half the Muslim population, insofar as the surveys are representative.
There's been
Support
surveys about, wanting Sharia law and so on and so forth, where
Yes,
numbers
exactly.
seem to be problematically high.
Exactly, yeah. And specific aspects of it, let's say if you were going to ask, and surveys have been done about this kind of issue about the outlawing of homosexuality and so on and so forth, you'll get quite substantial numbers of Muslims who would support those kinds of moves. And as you rightly say, the broader question of Sharia, whatever that means in the current context, right? What does Sharia actually mean? But to the extent that it's an intelligible thing for Muslims to answer, a large segment do subscribe to the idea that it's a desirable thing for Sharia to be implemented in Britain in whatever form.
Let's conclude on the point that we began, Dr. Shah, which is, do you believe that essentially the kind of rioting that we've seen in many towns and cities in the last few weeks because of what happened at Southport, the triggers, could it happen again?
Uh, yes, I mean, some people who've been making, trying to make prognoses of what the future holds. I mean, if the general scenario of some kind of replication of a Northern Ireland scenario is true, then almost definitely you're looking at something like that, right? So a kind of continuous series of low intensity kinds of conflicts accompanied by terrorism and so on, right? And imagine what that does for Britain as a place to invest, as a place to live. It almost becomes a no-no for people. Look at what the history of Northern Ireland is. Until the Northern Irish conflict was settled, through very concerted political effort. The Northern Ireland was a disaster. It was an economic disaster. I think it probably only survived because of large amounts of state investment, which were coming from central government. But that's about it. So question mark: are we looking about at a more widespread uh, scenario like that in Britain? And leave aside Southport, some of the protesting that happened, in sympathy with what happened in Southport was also happening in Northern Ireland, where Protestants and Catholics seem to put aside their differences, right? And so that's a very interesting development.
Very complex situation and worrying situation. Dr. Prakash Shah, thanks very much for those very insightful comments. I thank you for your time. No doubt we will have opportunities to discuss this as the scenario evolves in the months and years to come. Thank you again.